I'd like to welcome everybody to the evening's entertainment. This is a panel on the private sector and militarization. And I'm Chris Demchak. And you can read everybody's names, and I'm going to presume we can read. We have 1 hour, and I want to get as much conversation in as possible. So we'll get started. When we as panel looked at the questions, naturally we were deeply inspired. But we also decided that since we were told as a dinner panel, we were going to spice it up a bit. And the way to spice it up a bit is to lay out an argument, have an argument, and then invite the audience to join in the argument. So we thought that would be a good thing to do. And as panel chair, I'm going to lay out the straw man. Ready for the agreements? Yay. And assaults? One thing I need to ask you all to keep in mind is it is an hour and it is dinner time and people are tired. So when we get to the Q&A, and yes, I will be ruthless to get us to Q&A, I will require that those who stand up to speak at the microphone have a question mark in their second sentence. You may have one for free, but the second one has to be a question mark at the other end. So if that's okay with you, let me start. I want to sort of lay out a worldview, if you will. Of course, we're here because cyberspace is global by nature. And those of us who are in cybersecurity know that it was also incredibly crappily put together. It's pretty easy to hack. And it exists where it exists today by virtue of a system that was set up for the last 70 years, basically as a liberal international economic system based on the rule of law, which protected most of the business models of most of the private sector companies that have made most of the money today. Unfortunately, its insecurity has also caused a contrary trend. We've known as the rise of borders in cyberspace as nations seek to defend their own cyberspace, always known as Cyber Westphalia on occasion. And what they're defending is their national well-being, their economics, as well as their information space and their people. Well, when cyberspace is so essential that it causes the reinstitution of jurisdictions in places that if you were around in the 1990s was never supposed to happen, then it becomes an issue that is a whole of society issue and not just a whole of government issue. And if it is a whole of society issue, then the private sector, that is the telecommunications agencies, the IT capital goods industry, and citizens involved in it, need to be involved and inside the tent defending that society. So the question before the panel today is, if that's the case, why aren't they there? Why is it hard to understand that the rule of law is under challenge here? The rule of law goes down, democracies go down. And by the way, it's very easy to kill a democracy. It's easy. If you take away their economics, you've undermined the tolerance that makes democracy work. If you take away the trust, you undermine the willingness to abide by the outcomes of elections. It's pretty easy. We've seen it done before. It happens on and off again. Democracies don't survive this transitional era. Then the business models of most of the democratic IT companies in the world also go down because they survive because the environment provides the possibility for them to get the return on investment that they expect. So we want to know, why is it there's such resistance to participating in whole of society? Why does it have such negative connotations? What's the answer? But tonight we're outlining 4 possible answers, and we'll open them up. And I'm going to ask each of my panel colleagues to address one of them. The first question, the first possible answer is they just don't really understand the system. They've been programming in their cells or their cubicles, and they don't really understand the threat. And I'm going to ask John Mallery to address that. A second possibility is that governments don't know how to make the argument for civic virtue, that somehow they've lost that ability, or they're underwhelmed or overwhelmed by the resistance. And I'm going to ask my colleague Yoko Nitta to deal with that. A third possibility is that because they're technical, they don't understand the value of the international, basically the liberal international system and international law, in defending their long-term potential and survival. And I'm going to ask my colleague Dustin Lewis to look at that. And a final possibility is, for those of us who are older than dirt, like myself, we were teaching in the 90s when the internet was supposed to get rid of governments. Remember, information would free everyone up. We'd all be democracies. All you have to do is link in. It'd take care of it. Those ideas still exist in some basis, particularly in places like Silicon Valley. If those places still have those ideas, is there any influence operations going on that maintains them? Or are people simply unwilling to give them up because it's easier than to program with security embedded? Not sure, but I have asked my colleague Frederick to deal with that one. And after that, we will open up the whole caboodle for everyone to discuss. So I'd like to start with John Mallery. And John, could you give us a couple minutes on this?
Thanks, Chris. So I just add one thing to what Chris said, which was that democracies exist within a homeostatic region, and when they get knocked out of those regions, you get authoritarian outcomes. And you can look at the history of Latin America to see what happened. It's a good test case for that. So I think I'm charged with the doom and gloom presentation here. So I'm going to give you the sort of the state of play. So we now have societies that are fused with computation and networking. And that means that societal vulnerabilities are now exposed via this substrate, and you can access it through cyber. At the same time, you've built the highways, analogous to the Roman Empire that built the highways, and barbarians can send information through these highways, whether it's malware or it's weaponized propaganda. And the way I think about it is in terms of multi-level cyber conflict and potentially cooperation. And there's essentially 8 layers of this, where we can go from the bottom up, let's just say. So the bottom layer is sort of the R&D pipelines, what's going into it. Then there's sort of the economic tier that where you're building products and doing things. Then there's a critical infrastructure operational tier. And then you get into sort of military and intelligence operations. There's a cybercrime layer. There's a policy and governance layer, and then there's an ideational layer at the top. In 1999, 2 Chinese colonels came up with the idea of unrestricted warfare. And the Chinese said, well, we don't really, it's not policy. But, there's some more tipping the hat to that than might meet the eye. And Chris Demchak and her co-author came up with the idea of cyber conflict. And so essentially what that means is that across these layers, you can have conflict. And I take the layers and I map them across things like deterrence, conflict, minimization, escalation dynamics, attribution, things like this, across all of these, and you see boxes where you don't have anything. And a lot of times we find out we don't have anything, for example, in the US with the influence operations against the election. We were not prepared for that, wasn't a critical infrastructure, and then all of a sudden we wake up because we see it happening. So that's kind of the background, and then what's going on in this space. So there's a lot of hacking going on, and so in the last year or so, we've been describing it as a set of 7 linked cyber insecurity dilemmas around the world. The primary dynamic is the major powers, US, Russia, China. And then if we go around the world, we look in Asia, we see a Northeast Asia one with China, a South Asia one with China, India, Pakistan, Middle East with a Sunni Shia axis, Russia, NATO, and there's also one in Southeast Asia. And so insecurity dilemma is when you improve your offense to feel more secure, but then the other actor becomes less secure, and then he works on his capability. In the cyber context, the great advantage to offense means that if you're going to invest resources to defend yourself, you're going to be best advised to invest it in more offense. So we have these linked up And the Chinese look at the US and they think, big and scary, we double our efforts to catch up with the superpower. Then the US looks back and goes, big and scary, quick, we better do something. So they keep going around this loop. And then on the periphery of China, other countries look at that and go, big and scary, quick, we better make some alliances, you know, between India and Japan, for example, something that never happened previously in history. So that's the challenge. It's a challenge, I would say, to the UNGGE and to many others, because what can you do about it? The things you can do about it are you can do state restraint, which is easiest and cheapest. So you can do cyber norms, you can do CBMs, you can rely on international law. It's free, but it's imperfect. You can do security and resilience to actually improve your defensive posture, and that's expensive and time-consuming. It'll take you decades. And then you can do deterrence for the residual. But the deterrence, if it goes wrong, maybe you're going to have a war. So that's sort of the overall environment that we're dealing with. And then if we look into it a little deeper, we have also a military cyber stability issue, that the emergence of the cyber domain is now integrated with sort of military operations across the full spectrum. And so it has caused erosion of stability both in conventional and in nuclear. And so we've been doing in some track dialogues trying to look at those mechanisms and what to do about it. So this is really a pretty scary environment. If you were to have a nuclear crisis analogous to the Cuban Missile Crisis today, participants would be very well advised to leave plenty of room for error for when something goes wrong in the cyber domain. So stability is probably lower. Into the bargain, we've had certain actors trying to improve their position, to wit, so the Russians kind of using the cyber and influence operations as a counter to NATO encroachment and their sort of feeling of insecurity but lacking buffer states for land power and that whole dynamic. And then with the Chinese, they were improving their position with large-scale industrial espionage and other kinds of practices. Both of these have now come to a head in the current environment. So we have very high tensions with the Russians and have difficulty talking and so forth. And nobody seems to have a really good idea on the table of how we walk this back. And then you have lock-in of sort of hardening attitudes and demonization of the other. In the Chinese case, we now have the US 301 sort of trade initiative, which is built around IP theft and unfair trade practices primarily, when the idea is to get the Chinese to stop doing that because it's destabilizing the international trading system. And both of these situations can lead you into potentially hot conflict. So I'd say that's kind of the quick lay of the land. And I'd say most people have no idea what's going on here, including many of the professionals, because it just hasn't got that far. It's kind of unfolding as we go. Some of the people on the panel have some pretty good ideas on it. Essentially, the task for so cyber professionals and intellectuals who are interested in peace research is to look for ways to stabilize these systems and walk the conflict back down. I mentioned one more thing while I'm at it is we don't actually have any idea how to do conflict management in this domain. So previously we've had a lot of experience in kinetic world, with conflict mediation and management and, the good offices of the UN and so forth to try to, walk things back. But we really don't have the practice in the cyber area. You can think about this in terms of the above low WAC, which is the threshold of arms conflict. You can think about it below. And so we've been doing a little thinking just recently in the last month about that question at an event in Wilton Park. But the conflict is going up below the armed conflict level, and this could get out of control, and we don't really have good ideas on how to walk it back. I'd say the US approach right now is to say, we're going to have more deterrence. Deterrence is not working, and therefore what we need to do is to punish the adversary more until he realizes he should dial back his behavior. And people like Jim Miller, who is the head of policy in DOD, believe that you're going to have to go through several cycles of escalation before they get the idea that you're serious. So I'll just stop there, but that kind of gives you the lay of the land.
All right, thank you, John. I hope you are suitably scared, because now we'll move to Yoko, who will talk about government response.
Thank you. Yoko, Nitta from Tokyo, Japan. Thank you very much for having me. I'd like to thank you to my Indian colleagues. I'm very happy to share more like Japanese, perspectives and efforts from the more like government approach. I usually talk about more like information operation, influence operation, what's really happening in Japan, and as well as security dilemma in Northeastern Asia. But today I would focus on more like, what is that title? Like IT tech companies and militarization, right? First of all, I would like to share with you the kind of this combination, IT companies, militarization. So in Japan, we are not supposed to be educated. We are not supposed to study. We don't have any subjects called security or like military things. Most of the cases forever. We don't have any kind of subjects until high school. So, and also for the academic course, like university and graduate school, we only have 2 universities that we can learn military security things. So, of course, this is due to the history things. After World War, we got lost, and we are very much allergic to the military things because we got that kind of, real experience, like atomic bombs and things like that. So in Japan, many of the people still have strong allergy to the word, to the phrase, the military things or security things. So in Japan, we do have a very positive, very good, public and private partnership. So we work really well together. For example, the industries themselves, they want to take initiatives, how to countermeasure cybersecurity, how to, countermeasure the major adversaries, whatever happens. So they try to incorporate government into their dialogues, to exchange information or to share information. So we usually have communication all the time. Of course, that the Japanese technology companies, especially focusing on working on more critical infrastructures, they're together more than 50 companies right now. They're together and discussing things and how to educate, how to raise the human resources for the cybersecurity, how to assist them, how to educate them. So this is a very beautiful approach, I think, and this is called Cyber Risk Intelligence Center Cross-Sector Forum. Having said that, we do have an issue. You know that Japan is very much good at science and technology. Of course, that is the main sort of the boost element factor to boost our economy. So many of the foreign companies or foreign sort of military industries, they approach us to buy our defense equipment, which we would never sort of expected, or we would never feel comfortable. For example, there are many exhibitions going in this global market. So Japanese tech companies, they try to promote their equipment, and then without realizing that they have realized that many of the nations want to buy our technology products to utilize for their own military use. So that's what our government's really much biggest concern. So we have been discussing, how to prevent private technologies from being diverted to other countries' military. But is it really possible, to prevent our equipment for militaries by 100%. It's next to impossible. So we do have some ideas to set up the committee within a diet by the bipartisan party, how to assess the situation and all kind of things. But also the Japanese government is very much responsible for this. So I try to summarize those concerns. I really wanted to put into like I really wanted to put them into like 3 bullet points, but it's very difficult, so 6. So how should we regard this development export of made in Japanese excellent equipment overseas? Are we planning to develop joint developments for military use from now on? Of course, fundamentally, many of the Japanese technology companies already feel really uncomfortable in exporting their products overseas because they know that they get trust. How to utilize consumer goods? How can we make more effective system for this? So what happens? This is more like security judgment. So what happens to the positive image of Japan as a very much peaceful state? So for the required transparency, how we can or should we implement this? So these are the real questions. So anyway, the Abe cabinet, he sort of, our team decided on new defense equipment revocation 3 principles in 2014, and we discussed how to proceed this, because there are lots of concerns that nowadays that are due to the budget, deficit. The Ministry of Defense, where I very much contribute, they have to think about to, not manufactured products of themselves. They have to collect those products from the private sectors and how to, control them. So how can we prevent Japanese technology from being used as a terrorist and used as a weapon to promote conflict? But just last year, we decided to export some defense equipment overseas with the very much strict, under some conditions. So we have to be very careful those products not to be transferred to the third country, for example. So there are lots of issues, but we do have a really good public and private partnership. So, thank you.
Can I just follow up with a real quick clarification question? I understood you to say that you have a very good relationship with the corporations, but I understood you also to say that it is a universal discomfort in selling IT goods that could be used by someone else's military. Is that discomfort extended to selling it to the Japanese government as well?
Yeah, so that's why that we try to set up the committee to debate that issue with really much confidentiality. Thanks.
Now I'd like to turn to my colleague Dustin Lewis and the international lawyer on the panel. Take it on.
Good evening. First, can I get hands? Who has heard of or knows what Project Maven is? Raise your hand if you know what it is. How about Amazon's recognition? Okay, great. I'm going to try to do 4 things in about 6 minutes. I'm going to tell you what the main argument I have is. I'm going to very briefly explain Project Maven and the Amazon recognition program. Then I'm going to tell you why I think international law is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere in this discussion and debate. And then I'm going to say my thesis or argument again, just in case you forgot it. So the first thing, my thesis. This discussion and debate concerning private tech sector militarization is deeply ambivalent about the relationship to international law. So again, it's deeply ambivalent. It's getting pulled in multiple different directions with the relationship to international law, and it goes to the heart of what we consider to be law's capacity to govern behavior in relation to things like war. So that's my main argument. So what's Project Maven? Project Maven arose a couple years ago. The basic idea is that the US DoD is building up an algorithmic warfare cross-functional team in order to use cutting-edge algorithms to help them scan through lots of UCAV or drone footage over Iraq and Syria to raise to the surface these concerns for human analysts so that the human analysts don't have to look through all the drone footage, and instead you can use an algorithmic system to raise those issues for consideration. Within Google, once Google was publicly known to have been contributing to Project Maven, there was deep consternation, and it ultimately resulted in Google publicly saying it was going to not renew the Project Maven contract, although that was only for a year and a half. And Google also elaborating some AI principles. What's Amazon's recognition? This is a facial recognition program that Amazon uses, and it arose in the news in July because the ACLU, which is an advocacy organization in the US, using an 80% confidence interval, said that Amazon's recognition, when compared against a certain crime database, found a 5% match rate for a misidentification rate for members of Congress. And then there was a back and forth with Amazon where they said you should have had that calibrated to 99%, and then the ACLU said, but you initially said 80, and then 90, and then 95, then 99, so what is it? And there's an open debate right now about the use of this technology in government for government use. So that's Project Maven and Amazon. The third point, international law is everywhere and nowhere in this debate. How is it everywhere? If you read through the Google principles, they reference international law at multiple points. Two of them include that Google will not design or deploy AI in application areas, including weapons or other technologies whose principal purpose or implementation is to cause or directly facilitate injury to people. This was their big concern revolving around so-called autonomous weapons, which we'll talk about more tomorrow. And the second one is they will not develop technologies whose purpose contravenes widely accepted principles of international law or human rights. International law is chock-a-block in this discussion. It's the primary reference point. It's not US domestic law, it's not ethics, it's international law. So why then would I say international law is also nowhere in some respects? There's huge misunderstandings, or in my view, there's a lot of assumptions that get stacked on the part of the private tech sector about the content of international law as it exists today, whether or not it's actually sufficient to do the task it's set out to do, and what the key principles, concepts, et cetera, are for international law. For instance, most international law today is based on notions of state responsibility, international organ responsibility, or in some respects, individual responsibility for things like war crimes. But you don't find much in the private tech sector debate on this about what the current content is, what the concepts are, and whether or not they're sufficient. And this goes to the heart of the question of, is international law sufficient to govern this new type of engagement where the commercial sector is the primary point of development, and then that gets incorporated later into military applications? This is different. This, to my mind, is new, and it's a really important concern that we haven't addressed well yet. So again, I'll end with where I started. From my perspective, this debate and discussion, at least in the US context, is deeply ambivalent about international law, and a lot is at stake. International law's capacity to govern behavior in relation to war, what we mean when we say a whole of society, if we mean whole of international society, whole of Western society, whole of Western liberal democratic society, or whether international law will be able to have this claim to both uniformity and universality, which is one of its main concerns when it comes to war, so that you know if you go into a war, which according to the War Report 2017 by Nitta, an excellent researcher, there's 50 ongoing armed conflicts in 2017. We are at war, and there's so many wars that are happening right now. If you go into war, will international law have that capacity to govern? And it's a really important debate, and I worry that we're missing a real opportunity to figure out what the law says, what we can and should demand of it, And I really hope that we can elevate that discussion and debate in ways that help secure international law's future to govern behavior in relation to war.
Dustin, a clarification point. Is it your argument that what we need is that the tech sector doesn't use it as a flag to wrap around their pre-existing preferences? Or is it in part that they need a sort of crash course on what international law really is before they roll it into the documents they spread around?
So my sense is that I think international law can do a lot of different things in this debate. I think that there's a lack of a shared vision about what international law is, what it can be, and what it should be. And I think that government hasn't done a good enough job of saying, here's how we actually already implement international law. So we don't have good sightlines into whether or not the tech sector can think that that's sufficient in and of itself. Part of that, I think, is on the government's behalf to not actually say what they do in terms of integrating for the JAGs and whatnot, all the analysis. But at the same time, I assume good faith on behalf of everybody. I think the tech sector is, when they say international law values, they're saying that in good faith. And I think they're deeply concerned about their tech being used for purposes that they don't ultimately want them to. But I think that there's real lack of understanding about where the international law parameters already exist today. And that's one of the big concerns that I have with it. I think the tech sector is well within its rights, and I think that there's a strong argument to say liberal democratic societies are strengthened by having dissent, including dissent in relation to whether or not international law is sufficiently governed and whether they want to use their technologies for these purposes. But for me, that's not where the debate necessarily is right now, because it's, to my mind, reflective of a much less sophisticated discussion on what international law can and should be as it already exists today.
Well, that's really interesting. It's a great segue into what Kara wants to talk about. I scared it. Reflect on how they view themselves, at least from the Silicon Valley perspective, and how that relates to the question before us today.
All right, so thank you to ORF for having me, and thank you to all of you for choosing this. I know you had some competition, so I really appreciate it that you guys are here listening to us when you could be elsewhere. But what I really wanted to talk about was, Chris mentioned some influence operations considerations before this, but I think the main point is that certain rifts exist between the government and the private sector in the US that are ripe for exploitation by our adversaries. And one of those is this massive chasm, we call it the public-private divide, between the public and the private tech sectors in the United States. So I had a front row to these battles at both Facebook and DoD for about 7 years. So I think I kind of bring a little bit of insider knowledge to the table, and I'll dispense that to you all as much as possible without violating any NDAs or anything. But what I think is very important to remember is that there's an ideological reluctance within the tech sector to work with the military and the Department of Defense, because there's a big perception issue. So we talk about Project Maven and the decision that Google took to not renew the contract because people think drones equal killing people, right? That's what you guys think. Well, that's kind of what some people in Silicon Valley think. The use of drones is not really up for debate in the Pentagon, but in groups of people and communities like Google engineers, this is seen as extremely controversial and even unethical. So if automation can do things like identify people, count the number of people on the ground, identify gender, then people are gonna start to think about civilian casualties, and pretty soon drones are gonna equal death in the minds of a lot of these people. So there are huge cultural barriers in terms of how people think about the application of lethal force, and they really come up when dealing with projects like Maven. But I think that this highlights a different and a bigger issue, is that the US private sector views itself very differently from the way military and security organizations view themselves. Again, I had the pleasure, or not really the pleasure, of seeing both sides of the debate here. And tech companies, rightly so, see themselves as global entities with a responsibility to a constituency that spans the world. So everyone in India, you realize that with WhatsApp, which Facebook now owns. Some companies have the majority of their user base outside the United States itself, like my former employer. So they're not overtly acting in US interests alone. I think this is forgotten in the halls of the Pentagon a lot of the times because they're incorporated in the US. These are US companies, right? But no, that's not how they see themselves, and they have a responsibility to the world over. So this also emphasizes a cultural barrier too, and a generational barrier, where there's a whole generation of tech workers that have come of age in a world where they don't really have to think about national security issues, so they don't. They benefited from an existing world order, and all of these companies were created during a period where things like great power competition didn't seem as important as they are now. And I think one of the key tasks is the education and the understanding of people, the engineers, that what they do, like it or not, has strategic and security implications. In this case, I think narrative is critical. And this is something that we talk about at the Center for New American Security's Artificial Intelligence Task Force. We do think that we have an opportunity to shape the broader narrative in a positive way. And this is going to take 3 conceptual ways of doing so. So it's about ensuring the safety of the men and women that we send in harm's way. Okay, this is kind of an anemic argument to some people. They're like, all right, we shouldn't be in those wars anyway, whatnot. But to the people that it matters to, they're going to think about it a little harder. We also need to say that it's about informing these people that the technology can also save lives by reducing civilian casualties and protecting US service members. So anecdotally, I spent a lot of months, over a year, cumulative in Afghanistan, studying full motion video footage from these drones, MQ-1s, MQ-9s, and I would have loved to reserve that analytical capacity to really make the harder decisions. I mean, there's times where, as a senior analyst of kinetic strike cells, the commander sits right next to you and he looks over and he says, Kara, is this our guy? And then the fires guys are gonna be basically launching the missiles to take human life. So when you can reserve your analytical capacity to actually think about those harder questions, build layered intelligence pictures that machines can't do, then you're going to be better served. Then the civilians on the ground are going to be better served when you actually identify the right person. They're actually the terrorist. So I think it's important in that way, and Dustin alluded to it when he was describing Project Maven as well. Also, we have to think about framing this in the context of a strategic competition. As you guys probably know, the United States recently came out with a new defense strategy, and what it is focused on is what people are calling a great power competition between the United States, between Russia, between China. So we have to approach the world and the use of force in this context and let the narrative relay that. So everything done in specific countries will directly benefit their military because of civil-military fusion in certain countries. Every application that Google makes in certain countries are going directly to the military arm of that country. So I think if we don't start getting all of the voices at the table, if we don't clearly communicate these narratives and really shape them and help people understand their roles within them, then there's going to be plenty of opportunity for our adversaries, US adversaries, other countries' adversaries, to exploit these rifts, and they really will.
Okay, thank you all. We have an intervention from the panel.
So just in listening to the previous discussion, I have a couple points just to add. So one thing at the top level that you should keep in mind in this context is that we have essentially military arms races in progress. So the Russians have been modernizing their conventional and nuclear for the last 10 years, spending $700 billion. They developed precision targeting capabilities. The same with the Chinese on the precision targeting. Chinese kind of been moving along, and this is extended out into nuclear, building more nuclear. Chinese are now merging their forces, and so the U.S. has finally responded recently that it's going to upgrade its capabilities. Then on the question of algorithmic warfare, and just make a small correction there, there are algorithms used in sort of military systems all around. They're computational. But the term of art, algorithmic warfare, refers to attacks on AI systems and algorithms to make them not work. And so this came up in testimony by the DNI, Director of National Intelligence, Clapper, in 2016 in his Worldwide Threat Briefing, where he was concerned on the first page about attacks on AI algorithms. What does this mean? What this means is if I assume platform security, so my cybersecurity is good, then there's going to be attack above that level. And there's essentially two kinds of attacks, but the one that most people are concerned with is a data level attack. So I give the system bad data and get it to recognize the wrong thing. This field's called adversarial machine learning, and in the case of neural net approaches to machine learning, there have been shown some ways that you can confuse the neural net. And in fact, Google did some pioneering work in this area. And then the other thing you can do is you can trigger computational complexity weaknesses with the right pattern of interaction so that the system will go down some rat hole, because some of them are complicated like planners. I'll give you just a little bit on AI applications in the military area so you know what's going on there. In Gulf War I, logistics planning was the big AI application that helped win that war. And so that's planning systems from AI to move all the material around and so forth. Vision systems came into play in early cruise missiles to follow land terrain. And now there's a lot of interest in target recognition, video, and so forth, in which it's referenced in the Maven issue. Robotics, there's a lot of action in the robotics. The robots are not just, land robots. There's air, sea, and space is essentially robotic and a cyber domain. And these can be autonomous platforms. So an important area in what's called the anti-area access denial competition that the Chinese started has been generalizing. The U.S. has been responding with its own kind of doctrine. The problem is to take out these heavily defended missile and radar installations. And so drone swarms would be the kind of thing that you would use. They need to be autonomous because they're going to have a lot of electronic warfare. Then, of course, cyber operations like the Stuxnet, which cross air gaps, those have to be autonomous as well. And then space again. Another application area is decision making. So this is fairly dangerous because you really want to not be making mistakes in the decision making, so good to have the human in the loop. But I understand the Chinese are very interested in that. So overall, the situation gets you into what we've been calling for years strategic technical competition, and the Chinese are now calling technology Cold War. And this is the idea is you develop your economic and technical capability to stay ahead of the other guy. You transfer it into military. That then translates into military power, and then that translates into geopolitical power balancing and how much of the world you can run with your rules or influence or deter. So I just put that out for a few clarifications.
Did I get it? Thank you, John. We'll open it up for questions, and while we're opening it up for questions, remember the rule of 2 sentences, if you would, please. I'm going to make a couple of, just an overarching remark. We started with the idea that the noose is tightening, and the difficulty is, our concern of the panel, or straw man if you like, is that the tech community has grown up in a very safe, complacent world. And that world is not the world of reality increasingly today. At the major adversaries, as those who've ever studied security, you don't get the choice. They make it for you. Like any relationship, someone takes you into the fight unilaterally, and they are, in fact, bringing it to them. That's on the national level. That's the question of what is a public good, what is civic responsibility. Yes, these corporations are global. They're global by virtue of this very system that is declining. And therefore, what is the long-term prognosis for those business models? If it doesn't work just to say it's a good idea to defend democracies, then let's talk about your rice bowl over time. And the second issue that's already been raised is their level of education about the very topics on which they refuse to serve. I will give one small anecdote myself. 3 years ago, I went to a neighboring college because I wanted to have some students help me program an unclassified cyber game. And I gave them a talk about cybersecurity. And there was this slack-jawed, gobsmacked look on their faces, because here they were, seniors, getting a degree in gaming, and 90% of them are employed in IT in normal corporations, and they had never had a single course on cybersecurity, not one, period. I will tell you now that the same college has 3. It's a requirement in their, but it hadn't had one. And they thought this was fascinating. No one had ever told them before. It's like, okay, we're not reaching you guys. We're definitely not reaching these people. And we're definitely not pointing out to them that they are needed in this particular struggle, and we do not have a choice. So that's the straw man that we'd like to take on. Oh, I want to add one more thing. You'll note I said whole of society. I didn't say whole of government, right? So I didn't say, oh, whole of military, right? There are many, many, many ways you can participate and defend this democracy that's so beneficial to you without directly giving something to the Pentagon or to someone else. So, okay, questions, or have we scared you all? I think we're supposed to go to the microphone, or someone brings it to you. I can hear you, but I don't know if the people in the back can. Yeah, please.
So my question was on the militarization of cyberspace itself. So the context is there's been increasing discourse on hackbacks, the active cyber defense certainty in the act in the US, where entities that get hacked largely in the private sector have possibly been delegated the right to engage in activities that go into the sort of adversaries network. So how should law, including international law and governments, co-opt this ability of the private sector without leading to, I mean, colloquially, cyber anarchy?
A quick question. You're asking about companies engaging in hackbacks? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. I think we'll ask the...
I can do it, and Dustin can clean it up. So essentially, as in nuclear, the key concept is to have positive control of weapons by national command authorities, so you know who you're dealing with. And so the similar sort of logic applies to non-state actors running around hacking somebody. This can be confused, and then you can have problems. So the U.S. policy has been that they don't want to have random actors taking this kind of action themselves. And so that's the logic. There is some activity in this area, but it's definitely a problem, and it can be an important source of instability, especially if that starts happening in time of crisis, especially if the hackbacks, say, are against somebody like the Russians, who tend to use some organized crime elements that start getting hacked in a crisis. They may interpret that in a way that the local actor doing this activity had no idea, whereas the state might be more aware and not trigger the problem.
I want to channel Mike Schmidt. You can't, it's illegal, don't do it. It's pretty straightforward, because you risk bringing your entire government into it, because usually the major adversaries don't believe you did it on your own little self. Therefore, they're going to assume you were paid off or used as a proxy.
So one more point on that is that under international law, a state has a responsibility to prevent actors from engaging in armed attacks on its territory. And the UNGG has a norm which basically translated that into the cyber domain, and so that states should prevent that kind of activity.
So since we discussed the private sector's hackbacks, let's move on to the state. US recently, the Pentagon released Defense Department cyber strategy, the summary of it. And they actually repeated 5 times the phrase defend forward. So that basically synonymous with something like, not hackback, but it's preventive. If the Department of Defense sees some threat, then they will defend forward. And there was a debate on Twitter whether this actually is an effective tool of deterrence, not tool, signal for deterrence, or if it might actually provoke more conflict. What is your take on that?
We'll let the panel, would the panel like to address the comment? Other people on the panel? Defend forward.
All right, so yeah, we talk a lot about this persistent presence. I'm not a cybersecurity expert, but I do dabble. So I think the key here is imposing costs, right? So it's like what we try to do with influence operations. You try to, in this case, I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to reset the conditions for effective deterrence, because if you've seen things like, we've been pretty lax about enforcing our quote-unquote red lines in terms of cyber attacks in the past. These naming and shaming doesn't always work in the cyber context. I know Chris has some opinions on that as well. But I think the key here is slightly analogous to the counterterrorism fight, right? So the reason why the US was fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq is we wanted to take it to the enemy. We wanted to keep the pressure on there and sustain that in order to prevent them from attacking back home. So if you impose costs, engage persistent presence, I mean, that's the strategic concept behind the whole defend forward mentality. And I think it's actually worth a shot because it's obvious what we've been doing before hasn't been working.
One other possibility is you have to think about what the term forward actually means. So the 90% of what we call the internet goes on across undersea cables. And every single one of those cables comes up on someone's sovereign territory. So one way to think about it is, where is actual international cyberspace? Does it start before a packet hits that first server on your sovereign territory? Does it start halfway across the ocean? So what is forward? If I'm defending forward, but if I'm blunting an attack by going to the first external server that is supporting those attacks, okay? When do I do that? Do I do that during the attack? And in fact, I believe in international law, you have to wait till the attack commences before you can do that. Unless you consider the attack imminent and of consequence. Again, channeling my Mike Schmidt here. And in those contexts, so defending forward could be, I consider the attack imminent, I'm moving to that server, and it happens to be not on my sovereign territory. That's not necessarily destabilizing, is it? So I would say.
So just to pick up on that, so in terrorism, the problem is that you have vast attack surfaces that you can't defend, and so you need to be intelligence-driven and try to stop them before you can do it. Similar in the cyber domain, due to the offense advantage, he's going to get you if he wants to, so you want to try to disrupt him going forward. There's different stories on the disruption story. There's this Cyber Command active defense, a persistent engagement idea, and when you dig down into the papers supporting it, they have 3 tiers. So tier 1 is hunt them on the network, so that's not so bad, it's your own network. Tier 2 is hunt them in the gray zone and disrupt him there, so he's got some botnet or other, and you're going to go after that. And tier 3 is actually reach into their own networks. They're very foggy in the public about what they're going to say about that. In terms of the other point in the question, which is how is the counterparty going to look at the action, this is really the crux of the entire problem as far as I can see, is that we have narratives developing both on, say, the US side, the Russian side, and the Chinese side of victimhood, and that they are suffering some kind of attacks, which is mostly espionage, but and they built up this narrative. The Russian case is really very pronounced, that the West is out to get them all these ways, and they're just trying to push back and do deterrence against us. And then if we in the US come back with responses, there's the danger that we get into a pathological deterrence situation where those actions are not interpreted as deterrent moves, they're interpreted as belligerence, and you get into a feud cycle. And a similar thing occurs with China. And then into the bargain, we throw cross-cultural interpretation, different histories, different kinds of insecurities, and in the Chinese case, we throw in, a Marxist-Leninist, overlay. And then you have a lot of misunderstanding, failure to emphasize.
Thank you, John. Question?
Thank you, Chair. And I must apologize, I missed the first half of this panel, so I don't know if this was covered during that time, but I just want to touch on something that Kara mentioned about how the domestic development or the national development of military technologies is directly proportionate to the civil and military infusion. My question is this: if the rate of development of these technologies in the private sector moves beyond what is the military development of these technologies, then do you see even democratic countries imposing something similar to a compulsory licensing requirement? on the basis of national security and the imminence of danger, to acquire some of these technologies from the private sector? Thank you.
I have a point of clarification on that question. Your argument is that if the technologies, you said, reached beyond the military use, or did I misunderstand you?
I meant if the rate of development of these technologies in the civilian sector are much faster, much better than what is within the military sector.
Okay.
So I think it's an interesting question, right? Is the government ever going to compel the private sector to give them technological advantage if they don't have it for themselves? I think that is a question that's been not taken seriously in terms of actually compelling anyone, but the idea that the private sector is outpacing the military technological development. I mean, that's pretty much taken as a given right now in the Pentagon. So we're instituting measures to help prevent that in terms of, I don't know if you guys have heard of the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, but it's within the Pentagon, which is really interesting. And what they're going to do is they're basically going to take all AI and military applications of AI and develop them further. They have a more streamlined acquisitions process, because one of the biggest problems is the Department of Defense is this big lumbering organization with a lot of overhead, and it takes so much time, years, for people to actually get these technologies and use them for military purposes in an official capacity. So we're finding ways to sort of circumvent those old processes, to speed up those old processes, and make the acquisition of new technologies more efficient in the Pentagon, so that we won't have to compel these companies to do something like that. That's not what defines American values, and I don't think it will in the future. In addition, I think that as long as there are cutting-edge basic and applied research questions in the AI space with military applications, you're gonna get the talent to come into the government that wants to work on these really, really interesting questions. Before, people are joining these tech companies, and yeah, maybe they're only doing it for civilian reasons because they don't really think that they're gonna put algorithms directly on a sensor to, look at what's happening on the ground via drones. So now that this is actually happening, I think there's a lot of people, a lot of young kids who they do think these are the most interesting questions of our time. I mean, really, it's life and death. How much more exciting does it get for a young engineer? And there's an important cadre of people who are going to join, and they're going to apply their technical acumen and all their talents to developing these technologies so that we can use them in the service of the federal government. So I think we don't have to resort to compelling the government. Apple and San Bernardino, that's a different question, but we won't talk about that right now.
Yeah, I just want to make a quick comment, too, about how Americanized this conversation is. If you really want to know something about how governments will defend themselves, you have to look for where is the central locus of computer knowledge in the government. By a happenstance of history, it happens to be in the Department of Defense in the United States. It is not in other countries. They will not be defining their whole of society computer knowledge based on their military. Most westernized militaries do not have that capacity because it rests in their SIGINT agencies, which are almost always civilian. And they rest in other places too. Yes, they have close relationships with the military. So even the term militarization leads you down a path that could lead you to misunderstand what kinds of ways that the technical sector can actually participate in that. So, all right.
Yeah, I just wanted to add some comments from the Japan side. So we do have called Science Council of Japan, which is called science is in a diet thing. So they're sort of the cabinet office body, and within the council, we have been debating whether we should separate scientists from military research or some things like that, and because we do, and Japanese government and cabinet office has a responsibility, for the accountability for how to deal with this military, activities or military research. Thank you.
So my point is that for 25 years and plus, the United States military has been riding what's called the COTS curve. So this is civilian technology due to the fact that the scale economies drive the costs lower, and that's why you can have informationized militaries. And everybody else is doing the same thing. So essentially, this IT sector is fueling all the militaries, and previously they had what they called GOTS, and that was government off the shelf. And these are high assurance systems that were used, for example, in nuclear weapons that would be rad hardened and so forth, and hard to break into. And by ingesting the commercial technologies, the security's gone way down, making these highly vulnerable, and then producing lots of military instability. So that's our environment, and we're just doing more of it, intensifying and deepening the technologies. And yes, there are the specialty, sort of boutique add-ons that the militaries will invest in. So therefore, the tech sector is deeply embedded in all of the military activity.
Okay, next.
Thank you. My question is for Dustin. Dustin, as I'm sure you're aware, there's an obligation contained in Article 36 of the Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions. I know the US isn't party to that, but it's part and parcel of custom international law nevertheless. And the obligation is that states must review the weapons or the offensive capabilities that they develop to ensure that they're compatible with the prescriptions of the law of war before they deploy them onto the battlefield. So my question for you is, does Article 36, if it's worked and implemented effectively, assuage some of the concerns that you had about the development of these weapons in combination with the private sector?
So I also don't think India is a state party to AP1. So the question is, but I think it's a customary obligation. You can't field a weapon
if you don't have sufficient grounds to anticipate in regular circumstances how it's going to work in the field. And I think that it's an open question right now as to what exact standards the militaries are applying in relation to weapons reviews in conventional weapons, some with AI techniques, some without, and also in relation to cyber capabilities. This is all a black box if you don't have a clearance. So I think absolutely armed forces are under legal obligation to do these reviews at all relevant stages, development, acquisition, et cetera, and to review them afterwards. AI and especially machine learning raise concerns that I don't have good sightlines into because I don't have a security clearance. And I don't know, though, that a commander necessarily would want to deploy a weapon that would behave in an unpredictable manner. And yet that's exactly part of the promise in some respect, depending on how you define AI, machine learning, what the different applications are. So the very short version is, I don't think we know enough because we're not on inside, but I have reason to suspect that there's, at least according to what the public statements are, a lack of a military interest in deploying these types of weapons because they will not be subject to sufficient foreseeability and ultimately reconstructability as well, which I think would be an important aspect of the legal framework.
Yeah, I'm going to add that most, particularly in the consolidated democracies, that kind of decision to deploy a tool is extraordinarily, excruciatingly precise, and very, very concerned about the blowback, collateral damage, the loss of control, et cetera. That is not true for the major adversaries, and it is one of the grosser dilemmas that we face, is what happens when the tool that could have stopped X was not deployed because of our concerns, but is deployed by the adversaries.
So I want to build on that one, Chris, because we need to flag the DoD directive in 2012 on autonomous weapons, in which it requires you to have platform security and be able to show that it's going to operate correctly. And so Chris is saying the right thing, and we've had the discussion in this room for the last 2 years on what's going to happen with those weapons when lesser actors who are not paying attention to the legal issues, like the United States, start deploying these kinds of weapons. Will they do the due diligence that you need to do in order to engineer them properly to assure that they're performing according to spec, in these battle space situations, and not causing, war crimes, basically.
Let's just make a call for that. And what happens when the private sector stands aside and lets the military do what they thought was due diligence and made a mistake because they didn't have the talent to help them? right? What are the consequences there? And that's a civic responsibility that people need to know that they have. I'm going to take one final question. I know we're already a little bit late, so let's take one final question.
Thank you. So in response to growing militarization of the private sector, you see increased economic protectionism, for example, with the CFIUS reform or the proposed EU regulation on an FDI screening mechanism. So my question is, how do you increase regulation on the export of potential dual-use goods without stifling the innovation in the private sector? For example, in Europe, there's just not the venture capital to fund seed or beta stage startups, and they look abroad. So how do you kind of strike a good balance between those two?
I'm sorry, the prerogative of the chair, I got to respond. I do not think the militarization is causing the problem, number one. Number two, this is a false image that if we do any regulation, then innovation will crawl up and die like a little bug on the floor. This has never been the case in any context. And there's no special accord given to the IT capital goods sector that makes them special in the world, so that the car companies tried to claim that in the 1960s. We don't have to do seatbelts because we're special. That part, it's not you personally, but I think we have to understand the character of innovation. The people that are in it because they love it. And they will do it even under the conditions of civic responsibility. And I think that is part of the reason that we have to understand that it is okay to consider these kinds of regulations and this kind of, well, as I say, civic responsibility. And I just leapt in, so panel.
Could I ask a quick follow-up question to kind of clarify? Specifically in the AI arms race, you see kind of right now the balance is between the US and China, but then European companies, because they don't have venture capitalists in Europe, they look to China or US investors. So how do you protect?
Let me, that was what I lost my own thought. I'm sorry, it's late. Let me give you a quick little story. Why does Silicon Valley survive better than Route 128 in Boston? Because at the beginning, they were equivalent in their talent. And I'm going to tell you something we don't generally look at. It was NDAs. In California, they had non-disclosure agreements, but they were not enforced. In Boston, they were ruthlessly enforced. You want to kill your startup community? Ruthlessly enforce your NDAs. Every person who goes and works for a firm and walks out is told, you can't do anything in the field you just worked in for the next 2 years. And by the way, the Europeans have the same problem. They ruthlessly enforce them. It really isn't about militarization. It is about legal liabilities and the openness to actually do things like that. And the co-chair. Non-compete, my apologies. Non-compete, these are non-compete clauses, yes. That's right, my apology. Bill Gates stopped at IBM on Friday and was working on his new company on Monday. I tell you, if he'd been in Boston on Tuesday, they had already been serving him the papers. We're out of time, but I'm going to give the panel their final 2 cents, if that's okay with everyone. So I will start with Kara.
All right, so I think I would just two-finger what I said before, that I'm really happy that these conversations are occurring, that I really believe that there needs to be all voices at the table, especially now that AI is out in the open. It's being not only used for military applications, but for health, for medicine, transportation security, all of the above. So I think that I think we benefit as a society, as an American nation and as a world when all voices are brought to the table and we're actually having these serious conversations, and the engineering cadre can basically come in and help ensure that the military does use AI and emerging technologies in a safe, a robust, and a reliable way. Everyone is going to benefit when the dialogue is open.
So I would close with I think we should hold open the possibility that it's a feature, not a bug, of open societies to have vigorous disagreement about the role of the private tech sector in relation to militarization, and that as one of the consequences of the debate that's arisen around Project Maven and other projects is the potential to revisit the capacity of international law and the values and norms underlying it to be strengthened and revised in ways that adjust for this new distributed set of decision-making and conduct in relation to war?
I just would like to close with a quote from the Ernest Bergman in 2003. He published the book. So he said that science, I think that's a really the fact. Science was a major driving force for the development of mankind, but it was war that promoted the development of science. So we have to keep that in mind, and also the government should be responsible, how to deal with the situation. And Japan does not believe in escalation. And we have to keep this leadership things. Thank you.
So I guess I'll just give you a quick replay of the dialectics of victimhood, which I played for the Chinese senior leadership in their closed door high-level discussion a few years back. And the
John, it's 10 o'clock, so the dialectic has to be really quick.
It's short. So the U.S. cyber capability, came from the attack on the army in Afghanistan by the Russians, and then the large-scale operations against the United States. If we look at Iran, Stuxnet got done to them, and then they woke up, started hacking the Sunnis. So I would say moderation is what needs to happen in this space, and sensible policy making to moderate these insecurity dilemmas and not drive escalation and these feedbacks. And that's my closing statement.
It is out of time, so I'd like to have everyone thank the panel very much, and I hope this has sparked more conversations tomorrow.